All right, welcome everyone to the Puerto Rico Statehood Vote and American Democracy Digital Town Hall. This event is being hosted by the Puerto Rico Statehood Council. PR 51st is a project of the Puerto Rico Statehood Council, and we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to advocating for equality for the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico through statehood. Today, we'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to participate and be present in the event. We know that these are challenging times, and we greatly appreciate all of you making the effort and hope that you're doing well and healthy. Right now, I'd like to let all of you know that the event is being recorded and live streamed. So we will be publishing it later on in our different social media channels. So if you have to jump off at any point, you'll still be able to capture later on the information that we're sharing, but we hope that you can stay with us for the remainder of the hour. And just to provide a little bit of background, which may be useful, on November 3rd, America will hold its general election at a critical and transformative moment in our nation's history. The strength and resilience of our democratic institutions are being tested. And at the same time that that's taking place, 3 million U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory now for 122 years, will for the first time ever vote on the territory's admission as a state of the union with a simple statehood yes or no question. I wanted to start out by, first of all, presenting the ballot that's going to be presented to the voters in Puerto Rico. You'll see it right here in the screen in front of you. It's a very simple ballot, and actually it follows the historic precedent of Alaska and Hawaii, which were the last two states admitted into the Union, by asking the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico, should Puerto Rico be admitted immediately into the Union as a state? So obviously the implications of Puerto Rico's potential admission into the Union extend far beyond the shores of our beautiful Caribbean island and extend way into the halls of Congress and the depth of our American democracy. And to provide some perspectives, varied perspectives on these issues, tonight we've gathered three speakers that are outstanding individuals with great depth of knowledge on these issues. And I'll briefly introduce them. We'll give them an opportunity to make brief presentations on their thoughts about the topic of this town hall. And then we'll have a moderated discussion and then open it up for audience Q&A. So first of all, I'd like to briefly introduce Mr. John Caves III. He's the author of The New Model Federalist, a series of essays on applying classical principles to U.S. politics. He served in the Army in active duty from 2013 to 2017 and reached the rank of captain. He holds degrees in international affairs from Princeton and George Washington University and is a current resident of Maryland. His work relates to nuclear non-proliferation in a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit. Next is Mr. Scott Olson. Scott Olson is a freelance writer, a former congressional staffer, and a political partner of the Truman National Security Project. His opinion pieces have appeared in a variety of publications, including the Hill's Congress blog. He holds a master's degree in public policy from George Washington University and a law degree from the University of Oregon School of Law. He's currently writing a book on the history of federal policy in America's insular territories. And our third speaker is Professor Christina Bonsa Kraus. She's a professor of legal history at Columbia Law School, where she teaches constitutional law and American history. Professor Bonsa Kraus is the author of multiple articles on constitutional law and history of American territorial expansion and empire, and co-editor of Foreign in a Domestic Sense, Puerto Rico, American Expansion, and the Constitution. She holds degrees from Princeton, Cambridge, and Yale, and before joining the Columbia faculty in 2007, she served as a law clerk to federal judge Jose A. Cabranes on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals and to Justice Stephen Breyer on the United States Supreme Court. So on behalf of our audience and the Puerto Rico Statehood Council and the PR 51st community, I'd like to welcome all of you to our event. And let's go ahead and start off with John.
All right, thank you, George, and good evening, everyone. It's an honor to be able to speak here tonight. And I'm going to start, perhaps unsurprisingly, with a quote from the Declaration of Independence. Now, everyone knows the famous line about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But perhaps just as important is the line that comes right after it. And that is that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. The consent of the governed. Now, the Declaration of Independence is very heavily influenced by the theory and logic of the English philosopher John Locke in his Second Treatise of Government, published almost a century before the Declaration. And in that work, Locke has this to say. He says, "The government of a conqueror imposed by force on the subdued has no obligation upon them." And he also says, "If it be said they submit by their own consent, then this allows their own consent to be necessary to give the conqueror a title to rule over them." Now, what he's saying here, and was echoed in the Declaration of Independence, is that conquest, which is the means by which first Spain and then the United States first came to govern Puerto Rico and much of the rest of their territories, itself gives no lasting moral right to rule. Now, it's important here to note that I'm speaking of a moral right and not a legal right, and not, a practicality of, who benefits, practical ways from a particular association. It's also important that I'm not saying that I think that the current relationship between Puerto Rico and the rest of the United States is necessarily illegitimate. I think there is, a baseline of legitimacy, derived from things like the fact that there isn't really a clear, majority of Puerto Rico that supports independence, as far as we can tell. And there's been, some referendums and interactions between the elected government of Puerto Rico and the federal government. But rather that this legitimacy is somewhat on shaky ground. It's temporary and conditional in nature. And that something more is necessary to put it on a very solid and lasting basis. And Locke has an answer for this. He says in the same work, "Whenever the people shall choose their representatives upon just and undeniably equal measures, suitable to the original frame of the government, it cannot be doubted to be the will and act of the society, whoever permitted or caused them so to do." Now, this is important. This is the answer to the paradox, where you have, the United States has expanded, particularly in its early days, through conquest, and what Locke is saying is the way that, you can get a lasting moral right to govern, which doesn't come with conquest, is to extend representation to the people that you govern. And in doing so is essentially, taking the idea that might makes right and instead making right with whatever it was that was once obtained through might. And this is critically important. And the United States has done this slowly, imperfectly, in fits and starts over a long period of time. But representation, it has been extended across the mainland into Hawaii. And Puerto Rico is, in almost any sense, the logical next step. And this year, I think it's particularly important because we face this election where a lot of these fundamental foundational principles are being called into question, or perhaps even being neglected or ignored. And it's sort of up to us to decide if we're going to affirm them and continue them. And I think this plebiscite in November gives us an opportunity to fulfill this logic of just government that Locke and the founders articulated. And in doing so, to thereby reaffirm the founding principles of our republic. That's all I got for now.
Excellent, John. We greatly appreciate that, and really, it's critically important because oftentimes Americans are not really fully aware of how these core principles are not being lived up to, and how we really have a chance right now to do something about that. Both for the benefit of the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico, as well as for the benefit of American democracy as a whole. And to give us a little bit more background about the history of how these principles have played out in practice, we have Scott Olson, who's going to be our next presenter.
All right. Thank you, George. And a big thank you to the Puerto Rico Statehood Council for facilitating this very important, very timely conversation. And thank you to everyone out there who's participating tonight. This is an important juncture. November 3rd is going to be an important day for a variety of reasons, not the least of which a very important referendum in Puerto Rico. I have 3 points to build on what John introduced for us. The first point is that there is nothing new under the sun. When we are looking at statehood questions, we have a very long history to look at to inform our understanding. At the basic level, we're asking how are new states admitted into the Union? Well, this is a question that predates the Constitution. In 1783, after the American Revolution, the former colonies, now new states, all received from Great Britain their lands west of the Appalachians up to the Mississippi River. And the policy question for the national government became what to do with that land. So over the course of the next few years, the states ceded that territory to the national government in exchange for debt relief. And in 1787, Congress passed what would become the Northwest Ordinance. Now that very seminal, very important piece of legislation really did two things. One, it codified a process for admitting new states into the Union. And two, it provided a practical guarantee, if not a right to statehood for those territories. As John alluded to, it was not lost on the framers that they themselves had unshackled themselves from a colonial relationship, and they were aware that this was a potential problem when dealing with to-be states. And it was an important topic of conversation at the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So that leads us to our second point of who decides. And I don't think I need to tell anyone out there that Congress is the important decision point in passing from territorial government to statehood. And the Constitution has very little language on territorial governance and admission, but the framers left us a trail of breadcrumbs that is very, very useful. Many of the same men, and they were all men, who authored the Constitution were also members of the Confederation Congress and later the Congress of the United States that we now know. A few of them were members of Congress before and after ratification, and members of the Constitutional Convention. So they left us a wealth of knowledge. Second, they reenacted the Northwest Ordinance almost immediately when the first Congress convened. This is important because it connects the dots between pre-constitutional governance and the current republic. And it also provides us with a very clear pathway when we see that Kentucky and Vermont received statehood in that first Congress. So, while the framers left us very little language to go on, their actions in many ways speak louder than words and confirm this idea that territorial government was originally intended as a temporary expediency until statehood could be granted. Which leads us to the third point, and this is something that is particularly important in the conversation we're having right now. But I think it's important to remember that colonialism has always been a part of this conversation. When, contrary to the popular legend, when Americans of European descent transversed the Appalachians into the Western territories, they weren't entering an uninhabited, verdant wasteland. They were entering a territory where Native American tribes had lived for thousands of years. And the story of westward expansion is as much a story of the dispossession and displacement of indigenous peoples as it is about the expansion of the United States as a country. So it's important that we always consider who counts in these questions, and that's an issue that goes back to the very beginning when the threshold for gaining a territorial legislature was 5,000 white men. And it's a question that became particularly important with the insular cases. Now, the insular cases could be their own town hall, so I won't go into a great deal of detail about them, but basically they were a series of Supreme Court cases after the Spanish-American War. So after Puerto Rico became a US territory, that defined what it was to be an incorporated and an unincorporated territory. In basic terms, whether you were destined for statehood or destined for a nebulous other. But the important takeaway there is the insular cases changed statehood from a right to a privilege. And that's what has led, I think, to the last 122 years of colonial rule in Puerto Rico, as well as the other US territories. And I don't bring this up to invalidate the current statehood process or to draw on any questions there, but I think it's important that we keep in mind that these are questions about who is included and who is excluded in the conversation. And we have to be very culturally sensitive when we do that, and we have to be aware of that long and difficult history as we have this very important conversation. So I'll leave it there, but thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Greatly appreciate that background, which is incredibly useful. And then Professor Bonsa Kraus, we'd love to hear from you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you to the Puerto Rico Statehood Council for organizing this event and inviting me to participate. I don't know how familiar or unfamiliar the audience is with the topic, so I'm going to keep it pretty basic. But thanks to George, we're also keeping it pretty brief. So if you know everything I'm saying, you don't have to listen to it for too long. As George mentioned, Puerto Rico is going to have a plebiscite on November 3rd, in which the question is statehood, yes or no. And to the uninitiated, to anybody unfamiliar with this, with Puerto Rico's situation, that seems like a reasonable question. Puerto Rico's been a territory for 122 years. It's surely about time for Puerto Ricans to say whether or not they want to be admitted as a state. But as some of you may be aware, In Puerto Rico, and as Scott just explained, it's the most concise and helpful explanation of the insular cases in several sentences that I've ever heard. That was amazing. The insular cases made statehood a question mark. And into that nebulous middle ground grew a middle way. So the obvious options to someone not familiar with this are statehood or independence. But for Puerto Rico, a third option has been developed, and for other territories as well, though Puerto Rico is the one territory with plausible prospects of statehood, so it has different significance in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, the middle way is known as Commonwealth, and it originated in a process between 1950 and 1952. In those 2 years, Puerto Ricans adopted their own constitution with the authorization by Congress and achieved full local self-government, where that means elected governor, elected two-house legislature, a government really that looks a lot like that of the states. But in contrast to previous territories, Puerto Rico's constitutional process stopped at local self-government and didn't lead to admission into statehood and full representation with 2 senators and whatever the adequate complement of representatives was, and participation in presidential elections. So Puerto Rico kind of looks like a state, but is missing the essential ingredient of full equality, which is what's supposed to define statehood. Ever since, for the last 70 years, Puerto Ricans have debated whether that process decolonized the island successfully. Clearly, we've reached the point where we agree that it did not. But exactly what happened then and why it didn't successfully decolonize Puerto Rico has been the source of a lot of controversy. So supporters of what is known as Commonwealth status say that Puerto Rico should never be a state because its cultural identity would be at risk. Puerto Ricans, they say, are different. They really we shouldn't be like other states. We should have our own unique arrangement. And opponents of Commonwealth status say, no, no, no. Puerto Ricans, of course, have their own cultural heritage, but there's nothing inconsistent between that cultural heritage and statehood. And so Puerto Ricans should simply assert their place at the table, gain full equality and representation, and maintain their culture in the process. So I'm a believer in that view, but there is a divide in Puerto Rico between that view and the pro-Commonwealth view. The plebiscite, to my mind, should help clarify things. Puerto Ricans overwhelmingly want to be US citizens, want to remain US citizens. They already are US citizens. They want to remain US citizens. And the divide is really between whether we remain US citizens and enter into statehood, or we remain US citizens and remain a Commonwealth. And in my view, full representation is really the only way to fully vindicate one's full citizenship and equality in the country. The last thing I'll say is that in Congress, where this issue occasionally gets attention, a bill has been introduced by Nidia Velázquez, a representative from New York, and AOC, a celebrity you all know, providing for a self-determination process in Puerto Rico. This bill was introduced after Puerto Rico decided to have a statehood yes or no plebiscite. And the bill uses very inspiring language of self-determination. It recognizes the right of Puerto Ricans to hold a constitutional convention, and it authorizes such a convention so that Puerto Ricans can debate the various status options. The way it looks to me, there's a real question why a bill would be introduced after Puerto Rico's elected representatives have already settled on a self-determination process involving a yes-no vote on statehood. They don't need to be told that they have a right to have a constitutional convention. They know. The question of the moment is, what effect is this bill going to have on the process in Puerto Rico? In my view, the process in Puerto Rico should unfold. And if Puerto Ricans vote to be admitted as a state, then they should be admitted as a state. We've done a lot of debating for a very long time, and it's time for a decision. So I will go ahead and leave it at that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for those comments and observations, Christina, and thank you to all of the other panelists. We have some important topics that are very recently in the news about this issue that I think that your particular expertise can shed some light on. And, right now, just earlier this week, we had presidential candidate Joe Biden address the topic of Puerto Rico's political status in a speech for Hispanic Heritage Month, which was hosted in Kissimmee, Florida, which of course is a bastion of stateside Puerto Ricans. With Florida being the state that has the most or second most, stateside Puerto Ricans. And in his remarks, the presidential candidate expressed his personal support for statehood and expressed that it was the best solution to provide equality for the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico, but then said that it was up to the citizens of Puerto Rico to decide, and then Congress and the federal government should respect that decision and implement it. What do you think about those comments?
So I'll go ahead and take a stab at that. So I think that Joe Biden got it exactly right. That is, non-Puerto Rican Americans, all the other Americans, have a responsibility to express their own views on this. And I don't mean to be naive. It's really impossible to get broad views of all Americans, but certainly elected officials, federal elected officials, and persons running for office should have a position on Puerto Rico, simply because it's the right thing. If you annex a place and keep it for 122 years, you ought to have a position on whether it should be a state or not. And frankly, in my view, if it's a place where people have been US citizens since forever, 1917 specifically, and have expressed their desire to keep their citizenship and have expressed their desire for some form of union with the US, then I believe Americans should be supportive of statehood. At the same time, I think realistically speaking, statehood really can only happen when a majority of Puerto Ricans vote for it. It is up to Puerto Ricans to decide. There were, in the 19th century, some territories held plebiscites, some didn't. It was different then. Then it was a question of when, not if. But now, after the 20th century evolution of principles of self-determination and the real implementation of a more robust understanding of self-determination and consent, it is really required that Puerto Ricans express their own desire for it. I believe that if other Americans make clear that they would welcome Puerto Rico, that would make it easier for those who are resistant, hesitant, worried about what the reaction will be to vote in favor of it. And we already have somewhere between half and maybe a majority, depending on recent polling, in favor of statehood. So I think that other Americans have to say, of course, I would welcome Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico should be a state, but Puerto Ricans have to decide. And then he put in the third element. He said all three things he said he really needed to say. The third element is, if Puerto Ricans choose statehood, the federal government should take action, and we should admit Puerto Rico as a state. So I really think he walked that delicate line well by expressing his own support for it, affirming Puerto Ricans' right to decide, and insisting that the federal government must take action when they do.
No, that's excellent. John, Scott, any thoughts on that?
Yes, let me just add a couple of my own remarks. First of all, I agree with Christina. I think that Vice President Biden hit the nail on the head. We have to respect the will of the people of Puerto Rico, and I think that from a practical standpoint, it is important for those of us outside Puerto Rico and the United States to demand from our elected representatives a firm and values-based position on Puerto Rico statehood. This is an important issue. It's not a niche issue for a handful of members. It's one that will ultimately come before the House and Senate, and I think it's perfectly reasonable to expect folks after 122 years to know whether they think Puerto Rico ought to be a state or not.
Yeah, and I'll just chime in very quickly, just to echo. I agree. I think it's right. I think, you know, as I said in my opener, the consent of the governed is indispensable, and including to become a state. So at some point, Puerto Ricans need to say this is what they want. But I also agree very much that it needs to be a clear choice that's presented to Puerto Ricans, and it needs to be tied to immediate or, you know, prompt action. So I think too often sort of choices have been offered, but they haven't been clear, and there hasn't really been any sense that action would follow quickly, and then it kind of just kicks the can down the road. And that's a bit of what my concern would be with this House bill that was put forward, is that could be just a kind of another excuse to kind of waffle and kick the can down the road further.
Yeah, and I think that's a critical insight, John, because the reality is that there have been 6 plebiscites held in Puerto Rico since the 1960s today. And most of them have been, unfortunately, indecisive because of what Professor Bonsa Kraus was mentioning about the inclusion of this, you know, option that really is outside of what is constitutionally possible. And the last 2 plebiscites, which were held in 2012 and 2017, both excluded any fantasy options of enhanced commonwealth or anything that wouldn't be constitutionally viable, because there was a belief that self-determination has to be based on only the options that can actually be implemented and not whatever someone or some party thinks could potentially be. And when that has happened and voters have been given that choice, statehood has won. But the question has still been left out there in the minds of some, particularly the decision makers in Congress, whether or not a full and absolute majority of the US citizens of Puerto Rico support statehood. And the best way to answer that question is what's happening in November, a simple and direct statehood yes or no vote, where everyone who supports equality, everyone who supports full participation in their federal government, everyone who wants to have a seat at the table in Washington and secure permanently their citizenship rights under the Constitution, then they can vote for statehood. And everyone who opposes statehood, whether they want independence with free association, whether they want to continue being a territory, or whether they believe in the, you know, fantasy free beer and barbecue option, they can vote no. So it is really a clear decision that can come out of that. Do you believe that that a decision in a yes or no vote and the results of that will be more compelling to Congress in terms of getting them to take action on the matter than the decisions that have come out of other plebiscites where there have been multiple options?
I do think so. I think that, you know, Congress in the end has the discretion to decide whether or not to admit a state. I think it has been so very long that Congress really should not postpone, but Congress does have the constitutional power to admit a state. So it does have that discretion. But I do think that a vote on a yes or no question does yield a much clearer result than prior plebiscites. So the prior plebiscites have all had different kinds of questions, and any political scientist will tell you that any way you word a plebiscite question, you can create certain ambiguities. There's no such thing as a platonically, ideally fair plebiscite. You can only be as fair as you can be. And in previous plebiscites, there's been the inclusion of a middle option that is both not actually constitutionally possible, I agree with George, and not clearly enough defined. So people have been led in a direction that we can't go. And then there have been other plebiscites in which the ballot language has been contested. I haven't always agreed with those objections, but the reality is that there have been contests that have led to boycotts or that have led to arguments about what the results were. And so far, the plebiscites have really failed to yield a clear mandate, and certainly failed to yield a clear enough mandate, I think, for Congress to be moved like never before. So to my mind, a majority now would be enough, and morally speaking, it ought to be enough. But I want to add one more thing, which is that if for some reason there were not a majority now, that's not the end of the story either. We keep right on voting until we resolve this problem. And the resolution has to be a non-colonial option, which in my opinion has to be either statehood or independence. And given the preference of the overwhelming majority of Puerto Ricans for citizenship and union, it really seems clear to me that statehood is where we need to go, and we shouldn't wait any longer.
Excellent. Well, bringing it back to kind of the macro picture, right now, our country's going through a pivotal election where in a lot of ways, our democratic institutions are being challenged, and Americans are really pitted with a significant choice about what direction we want to take our country. And for a lot of people who live in the mainland, in their mental map, Puerto Rico's not really as present. That has changed somewhat since Hurricane Maria in 2017, which was a really stark visual representation of the way in which our 3 million fellow American citizens on the island weren't provided the same level of immediacy and the support that they needed during their greatest time of need. So now that America has more awareness about the people of Puerto Rico being American citizens, and polls reflect that now it's about 70 to 80% of Americans that are aware that the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico are citizens. How do you think that Puerto Rico's possible admission into the Union could potentially help to impact the functioning of American democratic institutions?
So I'll take a stab at that. And I think I'll take a stab at the first part, and then I'll let, I can get back to it later. But I think this is a very important, what you mentioned about just being aware of this and the significance. And often there is a lot of talk, a lot of times when you're speaking of Puerto Rico and its status, there's, the words, colonialism and imperialism will come up fairly often, and with good reason. Imperialism is the reason for the status quo. That's, why we are where we are now. But I think it's an important point to make, especially when thinking of how to argue this with the mainland population, is it's what sustains the status quo is actually something I think a little different. It's a much more narrow, sort of small America mindset that really sees America as only the mainland, only the 50 states, Hawaii, and doesn't really conceive of something, greater than that. And in some ways, this is actually an opposite of imperialism, which for all of its many faults was at least a sort of an expansive mindset. But it's sort of like a narrow kind of tunnel vision, and I think this is important to counter. I think a good argument to counter it is one that doesn't even necessarily involve so much these principles I was speaking of before, but that emphasizes just the 122 years of fellow, being, shared history, for most of that shared citizenship and kinship. There's more Puerto Ricans in the mainland now than there are in Puerto Rico. And this is I think, a strong argument to make, and Edmund Burke, another famous philosopher, makes this sort of argument in 1775 before Parliament in London for a speech called, Conciliation with America. He makes this appeal. He says, my idea, without considering whether we yield as a matter of right or grant as a matter of favor, is to admit the people of our colonies into an interest in our Constitution. Granted, this is some archaic language, but he's basically saying that, like, these Americans they're part of us. They're united with us in history and in kinship, and they've had this shared experience for so long. Like, whatever the principle is, let's honor that. Let's sustain that. Let's keep that going. I think that's a good argument to supplement the principled ones about representation with it. It's an inherently conservative argument, but it's one that can be made, and I think to useful effect.
Let me just add to that a historical perspective on how I think the inclusion of Puerto Rico in the sisterhood of states would change the political dynamic in Congress. I think the arc of history tends to bend toward more inclusivity, and thankfully so. And whether we're talking about people of color, whether we're talking about women, whether we're talking about Native Americans, Congress has a pretty poor track record of legislating for the interests of people who aren't permitted to be in the room. And I think it's important that we remember, when we're having this conversation about Puerto Rico becoming the 51st state, is Puerto Rico is not a small place, at least in terms of states. It would be a mid-sized state. I think it's larger than 20 or 21 existing states. If it were a state today, it would have at least 4, but probably 5 House members. So we're talking about a place that, even under the diminished role of territorial representation, is severely underrepresented for its population. And whenever we're talking about Puerto Rico in Congress, we're talking on behalf of people who are not in the room and not part of that conversation. And I think, fortunately, we've seen example after example in history of historical wrongs being righted as soon as we include people in the conversation. And I think Puerto Rico is a very important piece of the congressional puzzle that we haven't put in place yet.
Excellent. Christina?
I just agree. I agree with what both John and Scott said. I mean, I guess I'll just throw in, at a time like this, how to put this? The idea that Puerto Rico and other territories weren't definitely going to become states, that is, when statehood became a question mark, the reasons for it then were racist. They were blatantly racist. They were unequivocally racist. They were expressly racist. These people aren't fit to govern themselves was the reasoning behind it. So the reality over time is more complicated. That is, in the present, and when Puerto Ricans themselves don't favor statehood, that comes from a sense that somehow it threatens their cultural identity. And I don't agree with it, but I have a sense of understanding it and respect for it. I just think that in the end, statehood is capacious enough to encompass our cultural identity. And so, I think that the admission of Puerto Rico into statehood would, on the part of the United States, be an embrace of the anti-racist answer. it would be a rejection of the racist origins of the imperial move, which was let's take this place but not fully include it and not give it equality. So I think in a time like this, it's actually, it would be quite appropriate in a moment like this, with a heightened awareness of the difficulties in race relations this country has had, to embrace a state like Puerto Rico, which was held off in the past for really the worst of reasons.
Excellent. And we're getting some great questions from the audience. So I'd like to provide an opportunity to share some of those so we can help answer their perspectives and get your feedback on the topics that they're bringing. George Wolf writes, if one studies the admission of Alaska and Hawaii, the belief back then was that Alaska would be a Democrat state and Hawaii would be inclined to be a Republican state. As it turned out, the exact opposite happened. Alaska has been predominantly Republican and Hawaii has been predominantly a Democrat state. So do the speakers think that Republican Party's opposition to Puerto Rico's statehood, and here he's saying the Republican Party in general, we know that Republican Party is not a monolith. There are Republican supporters of statehood, many of them. But for the purpose of this question, do they think that the Republican Party's opposition to statehood might be based on the unfounded fear that the Senate might have 2 more Democrats when it actually might have 2 more Republicans?
So my understanding is that that is absolutely what the Republican opposition, where it exists, is based on, the idea that this would be 2 more Democratic senators. And I do think that the history of Alaska and Hawaii is instructive. I think that no one should take anything for granted. I know that Puerto Ricans on the mainland identify much more with the Democratic Party, and I think the island might at first, but I think Puerto Ricans also poll conservative on many social issues. And so I think that that Puerto Ricans are there to be courted by both parties. But as to the question of, do we think this is what the Republican opposition is based on, I think, Trent Lott used to just say it, and I don't know if Mitch McConnell has recently, but that is what they've said. So I think their view is, the view of the opponents is short-sighted.
And I'd just like to echo that, but I think it's extremely short-sighted. Even if this is going to be the case, and I think it's a big if, there would be 2 Democratic senators. No state stays a blue state or a red state forever. States flip all the time. I mean, we saw this in 2016. I think, it just requires a little bit of thinking past, the next 2 or 4 year cycle and think more of what's the deal, 50 years down the road.
Yes, I totally agree. And I have 2 points to add. One, I think John and Christina both make an excellent point that the political winds change and political attitudes wax and wane. And while we have a tendency to think that the way things are is the way they will always be, there's no support in the historical record for that being the case, especially when it comes to partisan allegiance. Now, that leads to my second point. Do issues of partisan arithmetic play into these questions within Congress? Yes, absolutely they do. And one example that I would point to Republicans who argue that that this is a power grab, which I'll say I completely disagree with. I think Puerto Rico has a long track record of electing Democrats and Republicans to represent them in Congress. And I think it would be a swing state if it were brought into the Union today. But one thing I would point Republicans to, if that's what they say is their main opposition, is 1889, 1890. Congress, under Republican control, admitted 6 states out west, some of which had very small populations that not coincidentally happened to be Republican leaning. And with the admission of those states, North Dakota, South Dakota Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and Washington, Republicans were able to hang on to their narrow Senate majority in the 1890 election. So yes, this has happened, and that's not an argument for or against statehood, but it's important to recognize that there are going to be political calculations, and advocates for statehood are going to need to come equipped with arguments to defeat them.
Excellent. Let's see. There's another question here about federal taxes. There's two of them. One is asking about how taxation would be impacting, and the other one's talking about Act 60, which allows tax incentives that are very lucrative to wealthy foreign investors in Puerto Rico. The investors fear the incentives would go away upon statehood, which is likely true. The assumption is that they have a lot of influence on government. Do any of you have an opinion on how these particular incentives could disrupt the desire for statehood for the average Puerto Rican citizen?
So I do think that for many Puerto Ricans, both the possibility, well, the actuality in the past and the present, and the possibility of unique arrangements, special tax arrangements, and so on, is a difficult thing to imagine losing. Those have been the source of some economic development in the past, although others have argued that they provide greater benefits to the corporations who benefit from special arrangements than to Puerto Ricans by virtue of employment and economic growth. So, but I do think that there are many Puerto Ricans who are concerned about the loss of those. And then there's also Puerto Ricans who are just worried about the imposition of the federal income tax in Puerto Rico, which doesn't apply there. So there are some federal taxes Puerto Ricans pay, but Puerto Ricans don't pay federal income taxes, or to be more precise, Puerto Rico's source income is not subject to federal income taxes. So that covers Puerto Ricans who would otherwise have to pay federal income taxes. I think that is another source of concern. So there are many Puerto Ricans who would actually qualify for the earned income tax credit, which doesn't apply there. So there are plenty of people who would actually benefit. And of course, there would have to be a transition to the imposition of federal taxes. But that this is a source of concern, no question about it. I remember a former pro-Commonwealth governor who was out of office at the time before one of the plebiscites publishing a full-page ad telling people, if you vote for statehood, federal taxes hit the next day. Like, he didn't even mention the fact we'd have to be admitted first. So you can play on these fears, and Commonwealth supporters have. It's not a trivial matter to make that transition, but it can be made carefully and gradually. And I don't agree with arguments that an immediate, overwhelming burden would be imposed on Puerto Rican people. It would have to be managed appropriately.
Excellent. Well, that's some really good feedback. But now, as we're kind of getting close to the end of the hour, I want to provide each of you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about where our audience can find out more information about your work and follow the information and the content that you're producing, so that they can continue to learn about these issues when you write about them and do work on them. John?
Sure. So I have a website. It's new model, like model airplane, Federalist. So 3 words, new model Federalist. .net, although if you plug in .com or .org, it'll get you there as well. If you Google it, be careful. There's a bunch of other sites out there, some of them reputable, some of them not, that use the name Federalist. Mine is New Model Federalist. And it's sort of a one-man show right now. It's not a big site, so if you go there and read some of what I have, I'd be very grateful for it, and I'd be honored. So
excellent, John. I would strongly suggest that you type into the chat box that information so that everyone gets that. And if you can, go on website, go on the Facebook and Twitter, and you can post that in the comment section below the video. Scott?
Yes, I maintain a presence on Twitter. I just put up my Twitter handle there. It's my name _A_Olson. I welcome comments. I welcome direct messages. I especially welcome stories from people who are affected by these issues directly. I will freely admit I'm an outside observer, and I'm someone who I try to be sensitive to the lived experiences of others. And I try not to put words into the mouths of people living in the territories. White men have done that for far too long, and I try to be very careful not to cross that line myself. So please feel free to follow me and share your stories, share your insights, comment on the articles I post, and I welcome the conversation.
Christina?
So I have a faculty webpage on the Columbia Law School website. I am not technologically advanced enough to have turned that into a link for my own fabulous webpage, but it's fabulous enough. So I have links to most of my publications there. I have a piece coming out in 2 days, I think it is, in the Yale Law Journal Forum, which is the online companion to the Yale Law Journal. So it'll be accessible online in a couple days, in which I criticize Justice Sotomayor's concurring opinion in the Aurelius case, which some of you may know was handed down in June, and in which Justice Sotomayor, apropos nothing that was at issue in the case, decided to write an opinion defending the in-between status for Puerto Rico without even letting on that it was an in-between status and much debated, but rather describing it as if it were the status of Puerto Rico that we all agree it has. So she struck a blow against statehood. Whether she understood what she was doing or not is unclear, but it made me pretty unhappy. And so I wrote kind of a feisty piece commenting on what she did. So that I would be honored and pleased if anyone read. And everything else is there.
And if you send that over to PR 51st, we'll make sure to share that with our audience.
Fantastic, will do.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank all the panelists and all the attendees and participants on Zoom, and also the folks watching on Facebook Live. I want to take a moment just to encourage everyone to please visit our website, www.pr51st.com. Follow our page on Facebook, subscribe to our YouTube, and follow us on Twitter. We're also on Instagram. And I'd like to take this last minute to answer a question that came in from Jorge Maisonet, which I think is critical, is how can U.S. citizens living mainland help to support the push for statehood for Puerto Rico besides reaching out to our representatives? And the answer is there's lots of different ways. Everyone is powerful. And I think the first thing is to go out and vote on November 3rd, because the members of Congress that you vote will be the ones that will be in a position in the upcoming session of Congress to potentially respond to this vote in favor of statehood that's happening on November 3rd on the island. And then write to the members of Congress, publish opinion pieces. On our website, PR 51st, we have a take action section. You can sign a petition. We're also now going to begin pushing more interactive content like this going forward. So not only are we going to be doing some town halls, but also some discussion groups that you can participate in. And there's also a targeted action stream that we're going to be putting out so that constituents and supporters can send messages to Congress in timely moments, like before hearings happen or when new bills drop, whether it's something we support or we oppose. And that's the message that we'd like to leave you with, that there's a lot of ways to contribute. And obviously you can always make a donation to PR 51st and the Puerto Rico Statehood Council as well, if you wish, and if you want to see more of this content. So with that, thank you so much to everyone who's participating. Hope you have a great night, and hope that this information has been useful to everyone. Thank you all.